bit of a landscape, so we know where we're at. We're at the beautiful Charlesland. We're at one of the roundabouts. We got the wrong roundabout, but we're here okay now. Now, you did sort of mention this to me last week, and it is something that it's very, very, very big and in people's minds in Greystones. The idea that there aren't any houses that are affordable for social housing, affordable housing, and really this is the crux of why you're bringing a motion. Hopefully you'll get to put it forward on Monday. It's a busy day, but you're going to bring it to Wicklow County Council. Just in the basic kind of outline, the motion involves what exactly? What's there's 3 points I think you were sort of making in the motion.
Yeah, and you touched on it right there. I suppose the first thing is we have a house crisis here in Wicklow, and Greystones, Kilcool, particular issues because we're so close to Dublin. The motion itself is saying, one, let's admit this, let's claim as local councillors this crisis exists, and two, let's try offer a proactive local solution, because there are solutions. And in this motion particularly, it's trying to look at the issue you've raised, affordability. So we know there's a social housing crisis. We've over 4,000 people on the social housing list. What we don't have in Wicklow is an affordability list. So we don't know the hundreds of people that don't qualify for social housing, but equally can't get onto the housing market and are struggling with rent, childcare costs. And this group is a lot bigger than people think. It's young families, it's students, young workers, older people retiring. It's a big cohort of people that are caught in that affordability trap. So my motion really is saying, one, let's start looking at creative alternative renting models, like the cost rental. Let's look at that. It works in Vienna. 2/3 of Vienna are in public housing provided by the local authorities. So let's look at that type of model. Let's look at protecting our public land, because that's a key issue. If we're going to provide more social and affordable housing, we need to hold on to social and public land.
So that's the one thing. I'm old enough to sort of grown up at a time when whole estates were just council estates. That was just what the purpose of it was, to take the weight off that community that needed houses, that children who grew up in the area, who now want to have a family, have nowhere to go. I mean, is that something that just wasn't financially attractive anymore to them? Was it? I mean, it does seem like it's a duty almost of a council to, as you say, protect residentially zoned land for affordable housing and for social housing. Why is it that it has sort of slipped away, that you no longer get that kind of commitment?
Yeah. Well, I suppose rather than get into a big long lecture
right.
about it, it's a massive issue. There's been huge policy change in housing. So there's a recent book out by a civil servant, Eddie Lewis, and that whole book traces this development of the kind of reform agenda in social and public housing. And that reform agenda was very much bringing in this new idea of the consumer in housing, and this idea of get rid of the concept of a house for life. So it was, rather than get into the details of all that, yes, there's been major changes, and there's been a shift away from that kind of, I suppose there's stigma attached to public housing. In the past, the local authority, there was management issues, you would have had large areas where there would have been, concentrations of disadvantage, and that brought its own issues. Whereas what I'm talking about, and what we know now from learning from all that, is that you can do public housing in a much more proactive, sustainable way. You can have mixed tenure, you can have people renting there, you can have people buying there, so the affordability issue, and have the kind of mixed incomes, mixed communities. And even if you come back to your original point there around social housing, the role of it, like our role in local council, yes, first thing is I'm here for people. They come to me, I'm here on a daily basis, weekly basis, meeting with people who have affordability issues or need social housing. But equally, we're here to be legislators. We are the policy arm of the local council. We're supposed to be the people on the ground seeing, is policy working? If it's not, feedback up to national policy. And we know that when we look at housing policy at the moment, it's not working. When we have these huge cohorts of people that can't rent and can't buy locally or in wider Wicklow. And if you take, say, traditionally the groups for social housing, so say people on low incomes, people with disabilities, they're still a major group in need of housing, and social housing is the answer. We're not building enough. And then if the other cohort, I'm talking about people who now economically would have traditionally bought in the private market, can't anymore. So the state has, I would argue, like education, health, housing, there's fundamentals in our society that are public goods, they're rights, they're not something you can buy and become a consumer. So that policy shift to the consumer and sort of the housing market, even in public housing, is not in the interest of the people. And my argument would be that as legislators, as local legislators, we need to be saying, well, what works? Forget about ideology. The market works in sports cars, it works in handbags, it doesn't work in things like health and housing, and we see that, the evidence is there.
Now we should say too that when you were looking into this, there's, the Rebuilding Ireland loans, which are available to people to sort of basically get them back on the housing market and help them to get into their own homes. But that apparently is very, very strict, and a lot of people you've met just fail to qualify because it is so strict.
Yeah, well, if you look at the most recent monthly we'd get the CEO's report from Wicklow, and if you look at the most recent report, we see the number of applications for these loans was 79, the number of approvals was 10, disapprovals 18. Like, they're really low approval rates, high disapproval rates, and then the other applications in progress. So where are they? There's a long waiting time. Their criteria is very strict, and people, it's just not affordable. And even what people qualify for, they're moving further and further away from where their work is, because we don't have local employment in Wicklow. Everyone's travelling in to Dublin, so it's not working. And it's not like my proposal, my motion isn't necessarily to say, oh, you know, housing isn't working, rebuilding Ireland isn't working. It's to say, well, what are the parts of that could work?
Right.
And the focus in it on building social housing. I'm saying let's be more proactive on that at a local level. It's in rebuilding Ireland. It's there. It just isn't being proactively driven at a local level. And I'm saying as local legislators we could start doing that.
Well, certainly I would think that Wicklow County Council are faced with the simple fact that in Greystones and Cool and Delgany, obviously there's a huge demand, and a huge demand not only for those who've lived here a long time and who want to sort of stay here, but then there's a huge influx of people happy and willing and wanting to live in such an area. So you've got this very, very expensive kind of, you know, game going on where developers can make a fortune very, very quickly. So that's obviously puts it sort of bends the reality for Wicklow County Council, that they know there is business here and we have to in some way address that, as well as trying to, you know, provide for those who can't afford beautiful houses in Marina Village and all that. I mean, do you think it's maybe there's never a simple solution for these things? I don't know whether you feel that there's certain things that are obviously going wrong that can be fixed quickly, or whether it's a case of building on experience and finding the way forward through, you know, the process of each time we can figure out if that worked, it didn't work. I mean, I'm stupid enough not to quite understand completely what's the best solution, but and it's a complex issue, and I'm not an economist, I'm a sociologist, so my interest is in the community and socially, how do we create more sustainable communities, how do we make sure that Greystones doesn't become a reserve of only those that can afford to live here, because diversity is important in a community. We should have diversity, people on low incomes, people with disabilities. We don't want to become an exclusive community where you only live in Greystones if you can buy in the private market. That's not healthy for the growth of a community or a society more generally. So I suppose my point would be that there are things that can be done locally that are more simple, like one, protecting our public land. We have a proposal for Lot Lane in Kilcool, which is public land, and before the summer, when the previous council was in sitting, there was proposals for this to be mixed tenure, social, affordable and private. Now I would argue that really we should be looking at social, affordable. Should we be looking at private as well on that land? These are types of questions. They're the simple pieces, but we need to talk about it. That's why part of my motion isn't pushing. It's saying I'm not saying do this tomorrow. I'm saying let's explore it, let's talk about it, let's bring it to the Housing Strategic Policy Committee and actually just start showing some local leadership. Because I really think for people, and I met this on so many doors when I was campaigning, like you're saying there earlier, older established families in Greystones whose children can't buy, newer families renting here whose kids go to school here, who want to settle here, can't settle down their roots. That whole building a sustainable community where you can care for each other and know this is where you're going to be. When we don't have that, so I would argue that our energies need to be put into that, building that type of community, of society. Yeah, the old wind is blowing on you there, sorry, as well on the mic. No, I will say that what's great about, and we'll wrap up here now, is that I can kind of get a strong sense from you that there's a huge amount of energy and a huge amount of really, really genuinely trying to dig into what sometimes can be just thankless work, that you're trying to find the real numbers and the real figures so that real decisions could be made. Now, just to let you know though, Tom Fortune, it does take its toll. Tom Fortune's only 27. Just so you know when you look at him that it does. Just so be careful. Like every now and again, take time out.
Come back to my point there. I lost her and talking about it. That's so bad.
Okay.
But the point I was making was around the cynicism. So people are cynical. They've lost their kind of hope in politics.
Right.
And I think that by showing this like local leadership, we're saying to people we can do something locally. We can act locally. We can come together and do something politically. So that's really, I think, this type of motion, what it does, it gives people hope again.
Magic.
Come together.
Well, I'll put up the details of the actual motion itself, but obviously it'll all be down to if you can get it in on Monday. I know it's a busy day. You've got traveller accommodation plans, and the climate strategy has also been debated. But when it does kind of put forward to the House, here's hoping that it gets momentum, because I think everybody feels the same way about this, that there should be the opportunity for those to live here when they've spent their lives growing up here, and they sort of feel despondent that they have to move 20 miles away just to be able to have a bed to sleep in.
On a very final point, because I was talking in the week to one of the senior advocacy people with the Children's Rights Alliance, and I was talking to them about the emotion, because before the election, lots of us signed a pledge around No Child 2020, which is around child poverty, and the biggest change in our homeless cases at the moment are the number of children. So in the cases that presented to Wicklow in the last month, 48 were children as part of that cohort, which, if you think about public housing and housing generally, it's what actually gives you a chance in education every other part of your life. So even when I think personally, you know, the fact I accessed education, I grew up in public housing, without that, for me, people say, oh, access to education gave you a route out of poverty. Well, actually before that, it was actually access to public housing, having security, somewhere to do your homework, somewhere to know when there's disability in the home. So we would have had a low income, blind pension.
Hi kids, how are you?
When you've got insecurity and disability in a home, other insecurities come.
Yeah, sorry, all right. Yeah.
And I think having a secure housing is a piece of security that you need, and even for families that are struggling on rents and struggling to pay childcare costs, 2 people working, the insecurity then of the rent on top of that, it makes life so much more difficult. So
it has huge ramifications.
Children's well-being and their best interests, which is really what the Children's Rights Alliance is talking about. Let's start doing local policy in the best interest of the child. I think even for that alone, taking away the big ideological arguments about the private market and who provides housing, if we think of children and their right to grow up with security and a sustainable community, we need to be prioritising more local action on the issue.